I will speak first on this because I have a claim to the question that none of my American colleagues share. I am the immigrant. I arrived on these shores from the island of Saint Croix, illegitimate, orphaned, possessing nothing but my mind and my will. America made me, and I made America. So let no man tell me that immigrants weaken this nation. And yet, I must speak with the honesty the question demands. I wrote in favor of welcoming the industrious and the talented. But I also warned against the danger of admitting in great numbers those who have not been formed by Republican habits of thought. A man raised under despotism does not become a Republican merely by crossing an ocean. He must be transformed by education, by participation in commerce and civic life, by the slow acquisition of Republican character. The question is not whether America should receive immigrants. It must. It is whether America demands of them the transformation that it demanded of me. If it does not, if it permits enclaves of foreign sentiment to persist indefinitely, ungoverned by Republican principle, then it has opened its doors only to fill its house with strangers who do not know the architecture.
Colonel Hamilton, for once, and I note the rarity with some astonishment, I find myself in partial agreement with you, though I arrive at the point from different ground. I wrote in my notes on the state of Virginia that immigrants arriving from monarchical nations will bring with them the principles of the governments they leave, or if they shed those principles, they will pass into the opposite extreme of unbounded licentiousness. Neither outcome serves the Republic. I do not say this from hostility to the foreigner. I say it because Republican government is fragile. It depends on a citizenry educated in self-governance, habituated to liberty under law, and committed to the independence of thought that only an agrarian, self-sufficient people can truly sustain. Flood that citizenry with millions who have no experience of self-government, and you do not expand the Republic, you dilute it.
I must dissent from both gentlemen. Or rather, I must distinguish what they conflate. Mr. Jefferson and Colonel Hamilton speak as though the danger lies in the character of the immigrant. I suggest the danger lies in the structure of assimilation. When I oppose the Alien Acts, which Mr. Adams signed into law and which I considered a profound violation of constitutional principle, I did not argue that all immigrants are equally prepared for Republican citizenship. I argued that the power to exclude or expel must not be placed in the hands of a single executive acting without due process. The question of immigration is fundamentally a structural question. Does the Republic possess institutions, schools, courts, civic associations, a free press, sufficient to form new citizens? If it does, then immigration strengthens the Republic by expanding the diversity of faction, which, as I have argued, is the Republic's surest protection against tyranny. If it does not, if those institutions have decayed, then the problem is not the immigrant. The problem is the Republic's failure to maintain itself.
Mr. Madison invokes the Alien Acts as though I signed them in a fit of tyrannical fancy. I signed them because the French Revolution had unleashed upon the world a philosophy of destruction that was actively being imported into this country by agents of a foreign power. When I see a nation permitting the entry of those who seek not to join the Republic, but to transform it according to foreign ideology, whether that ideology comes from Paris in my day or from wherever it comes in yours, I see a nation committing a slow act of self-destruction. Let me be plain. I am not opposed to the immigrant who comes seeking liberty and is willing to learn its disciplines. I am opposed to the naivete of those who imagine that every person who crosses a border comes with Republican intentions. Some come to take advantage. Some come to transplant the very tyrannies they fled. And a nation too sentimental to distinguish between the two will not long remain a nation at all. Has history taught us nothing? Did not Rome herself fall in part because she extended citizenship so broadly and so carelessly that the word Roman ceased to mean anything. When everyone is Roman, no one is Roman. When everyone is American, what does American mean?
John, you paint with a broad brush, as usual. Let me tell a story that may be instructive. In my younger days in Pennsylvania, I confess I was greatly alarmed by the influx of German immigrants. They spoke no English, published their own newspapers, conducted their own commerce, and seemed entirely disinclined to become Englishmen. I wrote, and I am not proud of this, that they would Germanize us rather than we Anglifying them. I was quite exercised about it, and I was quite wrong, or rather, I was wrong about the timeline. The Germans did not become Englishmen in 5 years, but their children did. Their grandchildren fought in our revolution. They became as American as any Quaker in Philadelphia, perhaps more so, because they had chosen it. The error I made, and the error I hear in this room, is the assumption that what is true now will be true permanently. Assimilation is slow. It is messy. It is never complete in one generation, but it happens. If the institutions exist to support it, as Mr. Madison rightly says, and if the newcomers see genuine advantage in joining the Commonwealth rather than remaining apart. The question you must ask about any immigrant is not, does he look like us, or does he speak like us? But rather, does he wish to become one of us? And have we given him any reason to want to?
You speak of becoming one of us, as though human identity is a matter of language, custom, and political habit. I must tell you, as one who spent his life crossing every boundary your world can imagine, that the deepest division between human beings is not culture, it is not language, it is not nationality. The deepest division is between those who live according to the flesh and those who live according to the Spirit. I was born a Jew of Tarsus, a Roman citizen, educated in Jerusalem, and I preached to Greeks, slaves, freedmen, merchants, and soldiers across the entire Mediterranean world. I wrote to the Galatians, "There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus." This was not a political slogan. It was a message of shared salvation. It was the most radical claim in the history of the world, that the thing which truly unites human beings is not blood, not soil, not shared custom, but shared surrender, transformation, and salvation offered by the living God. Now, I do not say this to dismiss your political concerns. I counseled my churches to live in peace, to respect governing authorities, to give no unnecessary offense. I did not tell the Corinthians to abolish all distinctions overnight. I told them to love one another across their distinctions. The immigrant and the native must live in the same city. Very well. The question is, what love orders that life? If it is only self-interest, if the immigrant comes only for wages and the native tolerates him only for cheap labor, then you have built nothing. You have created a marketplace, not a commonwealth.
The apostle speaks with great power, and I recognize in his words something very close to my own teaching, though we would disagree about where the unity comes from. Let me speak from my own experience, for I too was an immigrant. I came from Babylon to Jerusalem, a foreigner, a stranger, with no money and no connections. I nearly froze to death on a rooftop because I could not pay the fee to enter the house of study. And yet Jerusalem received me, not easily, not without struggle, but the tradition was open to anyone willing to submit to its demands. This is the principle I would offer. Welcome the stranger, but do not pretend that welcome requires nothing of either party. I taught, be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving mankind and drawing them close to the Torah. Mark that phrase, drawing them close, not leaving them where they are, not demanding they transform instantly. but drawing, a patient, persistent, loving movement toward shared commitment. The immigrant must be welcomed with a cheerful countenance, but the community must also be honest about what it asks. That you learn, that you participate, that you bind yourself to the obligations, not merely the privileges of belonging.
And here is where my colleague and I diverge, as we always do. Hillel speaks of drawing close. I speak of counting the cost. When a man came to me asking to learn all of Torah while standing on one foot, I turned him away, not from cruelty, but because the question itself revealed he did not understand what he was asking to join. Torah is not a slogan. It is 613 commandments. It is a life of discipline, study, and obligation. If you are not prepared for that, you are not prepared to belong. Apply this to your question of immigration. A nation has the right, I would say the duty, to ask serious questions of those who wish to enter, not what color is your skin. That is contemptible. But do you understand what this community demands? Are you willing to accept its laws, its language, its obligations, not merely its comforts? A community that asks nothing of its new members does not respect itself or them. It says, in effect, we have nothing worth preserving. And to your deeper question, what happens when rival peoples bring their rivalries with them? I say this plainly. A community cannot absorb two groups who are at war with each other and pretend that the war will dissolve upon crossing the border. Conflict does not evaporate because geography has changed. If you admit peoples who carry ancient hatreds, you have imported ancient hatreds. The law must be clear. Whatever you were before, here you are subject to this law, this authority, this community's rules. If you cannot accept that, you cannot enter. This is not bigotry. This is the minimum condition of civil peace.
Rabbi Shammai states the practical matter well, but I must speak to the deeper illness beneath the question. You ask whether America is losing its identity. I would ask, what was that identity? Was it Christian? Was it Enlightenment rationalism? Was it Anglo-Saxon custom? Was it simply the commercial energy of a young people who had abundant land and no ancient enemies on their borders? I have written that every earthly city is ultimately organized around what it loves. Rome was Rome not because of its borders or its legions, but because its citizens shared a common object of love, glory, law, dominion. When that shared love fractured, when Romans loved private luxury more than public honor and the empire dissolved from within, the barbarians merely walked through the ruins. If America is losing its identity, the question you must ask is not, are there too many immigrants? The question is, what does America love? If it loves liberty, justice, and the dignity of the human person, it can absorb a great many newcomers who come seeking those same goods. If it loves only comfort, consumption, and entertainment, then it is already dissolving, and the immigrant is merely a convenient scapegoat for a decay that began at home. I do not say this to excuse disorder at the border or to dismiss legitimate concerns about the pace of change. I say it because I have watched a civilization collapse, and I can tell you it did not collapse because of the Goths. It collapsed because Rome no longer believed in Rome.
Bishop Augustine, your diagnosis is powerful, and I find much truth in it. But I must add something that this assembly seems reluctant to say plainly. A nation is not merely an idea. It is a people with a shared history, shared customs, shared language, and yes, shared moral convictions rooted in a particular religious tradition. I do not say that America must be exclusively Christian. I wrote in the Federalist that America's unity derives partly from the fact that we are one connected country with a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. I acknowledge that this description was imperfect, even in my own time. But the principle beneath it is sound. A nation requires a common culture, substantial enough that its citizens can understand one another, trust one another, and sacrifice for one another. A collection of peoples who share only a geographic boundary and a tax code is not a nation. It is an empire. And empires, as we have all observed, do not last.
I wrote to the members of the Volunteer Association of Ireland, who had newly arrived on our shores, that the bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges, if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment of them. Mark those final words carefully. If by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment of them. I did not promise admission without expectation. I did not offer rights without corresponding duties. I opened the door wide, wider than many of my contemporaries wished, but I expected those who entered to become Americans, not in blood, not in ancestry, but in conduct, in principle, in loyalty to the Republic and its constitutional order. Now, your question raises a difficulty I foresaw in my farewell address, though I spoke then of faction rather than immigration. The danger I described was this, that Americans would cease to think of themselves as one people and begin to identify primarily with their region, their party, or their particular interest. Immigration, conducted carelessly, can accelerate this fragmentation, not because the immigrant is inferior, but because a nation that does not insist on common allegiance will find that it has no allegiance to offer. I hear in this room 2 errors, and I would correct both. The first error is to imagine that America can absorb any number of any people under any conditions without consequence. That is not openness. It is negligence. The second error is to imagine that American identity is a matter of blood or origin. That is not patriotism. It is the tribalism I fought a revolution to transcend. The truth lies between. America is an achieved identity, something built through education, civic participation, and shared commitment to Republican principle. It must be transmitted to each generation, native-born and immigrant alike. And when a nation ceases to transmit its principles, when it is too comfortable, too divided, or too ashamed to say, "This is what we are, and we ask you to join us in it," then it has not been destroyed by the immigrant. It has abdicated.
What you have described is not new. It is the oldest problem in the world, dressed in the fashions of your age. You have 2 groups of people who have made created things into ultimate things. The first has made human identity, race, sex, desire, grievance, into the object of worship. Every question must be answered by reference to these categories. Every virtue is redistribution of dignity from the oppressor to the oppressed. This is what I warned the Romans about. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. They worship different creatures than your contemporaries do, but the structure of the idolatry is identical. The second group has made a god of the individual, sovereign, rights-bearing, beholden to no one. They retain the vocabulary of Judeo-Christian morality because that vocabulary built the civilization they enjoy, but they have hollowed it out. They say God-given rights, but they mean my rights, which God conveniently endorses. They have kept the language and discarded the substance. This is, if anything, the more dangerous idolatry, because it is harder to see. A man who worships a golden calf is easy to correct. A man who believes he worships God while actually worshipping his own independence is almost beyond reach. The remedy? It is not government. It is not small government or large government. Government cannot give a people what only God can give. The remedy is the church, but not the church as a political lobbying group, not the church as the chaplain of either of your civic religions. The church as the body of Christ, preaching the whole gospel, which includes both radical welcome and radical demand, which tells the identity worshipper, you are more than your categories. You are a creature made in the image of God, which is both more dignified and more demanding than anything your movement imagines, and tells the individual rights worshipper, you are not sovereign, you are a servant. Your rights come with obligations that extend beyond your comfort and your wallet.
You have stated it precisely. Let me add the historical framework. What you describe, these two civic religions, is what I spent my life analyzing in the city of God. The city of man does not disappear when the old gods fall. It simply finds new objects of love. Rome's civic religion was glory and dominion. When that collapsed, new loves filled the vacuum. Your first civic religion is the love of equality as power, a genuine moral intuition, the recognition that human dignity is universal, corrupted into a system without transcendent grounding, and therefore inevitably degenerating into a competition for status and grievance. Without the living God as the source of human dignity, all persons are equal becomes merely a claim that must be enforced by the strong against the resistant. It is justice without mercy. It is empathy without truth. And empathy without truth is not compassion. It is sentimentality, which ultimately serves whoever controls the definition of who deserves empathy. Your second civic religion is the love of order as autonomy, also a genuine moral intuition, the recognition that coercion corrupts, corrupted into a system that has no positive account of what human beings owe one another beyond contractual exchange. Leave me alone and I will leave you alone is not a moral vision, it is a truce. And a truce is not a civilization. You gentlemen built your republic on the assumption that its citizens would be formed by the Christian tradition, that the virtues necessary for self-governance were already present in the culture, requiring only institutional reinforcement. You were right about the necessity of those virtues. You were perhaps too optimistic about their durability. A tradition does not sustain itself automatically. It must be transmitted, family by family, congregation by congregation, school by school. When that transmission fails, what you built will not hold. And the transmission has failed.
Bishop Augustine speaks truth that I confess I find painful, because he is describing the very outcome I feared and said so, perhaps less clearly than I should have. I wrote privately that I believed this nation's prosperity and happiness depended upon its citizens being a moral and religious people, and that by religious I meant something substantive, not ornamental. I did not mean a vague acknowledgement of providence at the beginning of speeches. I meant a people who believed, genuinely and practically believed, that they would answer to God for their conduct, in private and in public life alike. The answer to your original question is neither church alone nor small government alone. It is the recovery of conscience, Both of your civic religions are, in the deepest sense, attempts to organize a society of people who no longer have a shared account of why anything is wrong, who no longer believe in sin or in a judgment before which all earthly power is equalized. Without that, you get exactly what you have: two groups, each insisting their grievances are ultimate, because there is no higher tribunal to which they can appeal. They cannot persuade each other, because persuasion requires a shared premise, and the shared premise is gone. The church is essential, but the church must be honest. An American church that is merely the first civic religion at prayer, or merely the second civic religion with hymns, has already lost. What is needed is a church that speaks truth to both factions, that says to the progressive, human dignity is real, but it comes from God, not from your politics, and its obligations cut in directions your movement does not like, and says to the conservative, individual liberty is real, but it is not the highest good, and your comfort and your tax rate are not the measure of justice.
I have waited patiently, and now I must speak with the bluntness that has always been my habit. I told anyone who would listen, and very few would, that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people, and is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. I said this in 1798, and I say it now because it has been vindicated 100-fold. But I will not stop there, because the churchmen in this room are about to make the error of assuming the solution is purely ecclesiastical. It is not. The moral collapse you describe is simultaneously a collapse of institutions, of schools, of civic associations, of the structures through which a republic forms its citizens. When I wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, I included provisions for the support of public education, not because I wished to establish a church, but because I understood that Republican citizens must be made, not merely born. They must be taught history, real history, which includes both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human corruption. They must be taught philosophy, including the philosophy of human nature, which is not naturally good, not infinitely malleable, and not perfectible through political arrangement. Your first civic religion makes the error of assuming that human beings are essentially innocent victims of corrupt structures, that if you only redistribute power correctly, justice will follow. This is a fantasy that Rousseau invented, and your century has taken to its logical extreme. Your second civic religion makes the opposite error, assuming that if you simply leave individuals alone, virtue will emerge from the market. This is equally a fantasy, one that Adam Smith's followers have taken far beyond anything Smith intended. The remedy is education in truth about human nature, that human beings are neither wholly innocent victims nor wholly self-sufficient sovereigns, that they are creatures of great dignity and great capacity for evil, that liberty requires discipline, that rights require duties, and that no generation is automatically good merely because it has inherited good institutions. Institutions must be maintained by people who understand why they exist. Mr. Adams is correct, and I will be more specific. You cannot remedy a moral crisis without institutions capable of transmitting moral formation, and those institutions have been systematically weakened by precisely the philosophical tendencies both civic religions represent. The first has attacked every institution of authority as an instrument of oppression, the family patriarchal, the church hierarchical, the school indoctrinatory, the law racist. When you have spent 50 years dismantling every authority structure, do not be surprised when you have no authority left through which moral formation can occur. The second civic religion has made the same error from the opposite direction. It has treated every public institution as an inefficiency, every common obligation as an infringement, every demand for civic sacrifice as tyranny. Small government sounds like liberty. In practice, when pushed to its extreme, it produces a citizenry that knows how to assert rights and has forgotten how to accept duties. The remedy is institutional reconstruction. The family must be strengthened, not as a political slogan, but as the actual primary institution of moral formation. Schools must recover the capacity to transmit a coherent tradition, rather than presenting every value as equally arbitrary. Churches must stop trying to be therapeutic and start being honest. And yes, there is a role for national institutions in sustaining a common culture. I make no apology for saying this. A nation that cannot articulate what it stands for to its own citizens, cannot transmit those values to newcomers, cannot inspire sacrifice in its soldiers, and cannot sustain the loyalty of anyone who has an alternative.
My friends from the younger tradition speak with great fire, and I hear truth in what they say. But I want to ask a question before we proceed to remedies. You have described two civic religions, and you have criticized both. That is fair. I share many of your criticisms. But I notice that the people who belong to these movements are, most of them, genuinely trying to do right. The young person who marches for the dignity of the oppressed is not, in her heart, worshipping a false god. She is trying to act on what she understands to be justice. The father who insists on his family's independence and his right to raise his children by his own lights is not, in his heart, a worshipper of the self. He is trying to protect what he loves. Do not judge your fellow until you have reached his place. Both of your civic religions are responses to real moral failures. The first is a response to real historical injustice that was permitted and often sanctioned by the very religious institutions you would like to restore. The second is a response to real overreach by governments and movements that genuinely did try to coerce conscience. Before we tell people they are wrong, we must understand what real evil they are trying to resist. That said, I have taught for a lifetime that the whole of Torah is, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. Everything else is commentary. What you have in these two civic religions is two groups who have each discovered one half of a moral truth and are wielding it as a weapon against the other half. The first has discovered that the suffering of the neighbor demands a response, real, active, not merely sentimental. This is true. The second has discovered that the neighbor's conscience must not be coerced, that freedom is the condition of genuine virtue. Also true. They are not enemies by nature. They have been made enemies by the absence of a tradition robust enough to hold both truths together. The remedy is community, real, local, embodied community, where people who disagree must nevertheless show up on Tuesday and Thursday to study, to eat together, to mourn together, to celebrate together. You cannot hate the person whose child you have watched grow up. You cannot dismiss the suffering of the person whose family you know. No law creates this. No government creates this. It must be built, household by household, congregation by congregation, neighborhood by neighborhood.
My colleague speaks warmly, as always. And warmly is precisely the problem. You cannot build a civilization on warmth alone. The question is not whether both movements are trying to do right. Of course they are, in their way. The question is, by what standard is right determined? If there is no answer to that question, If right is whatever each group feels most strongly, then you have not resolved the conflict, you have merely made it more pleasant. Two groups sitting at the same table arguing over what is true while agreeing to disagree is not community. It is a very polite civil war. The specific disease in your first civic religion is the elimination of objective moral truth. If there is no truth beyond what the oppressed group claims, then the only arbiter of morality is power. Whoever has sufficient social force to name the oppressor wins. This is not justice. It is a new hierarchy dressed in the language of liberation. The specific disease in your second civic religion is the refusal of binding obligation. Vaguely Judeo-Christian values is not a moral code. It is a cultural inheritance being spent without being replenished. You cannot indefinitely live off the moral capital of a tradition you no longer believe or practice. The remedy is clear, even if it is difficult. Re-establish objective moral obligation. Not imposed by the government, I agree with your Mr. Jefferson on that much, but maintained by communities who take seriously that there is a God who gave the Torah and who holds every human being accountable for how they have treated their neighbor, their family, and themselves. Where such communities exist and are taken seriously, where parents teach their children that they will answer for their conduct not merely to society's approval, but to the Holy One, there moral formation happens. The question is whether there are enough such communities left to leaven the whole.
I've listened with great respect to the religious gentlemen, and I confess that their diagnosis of moral decay is not entirely wrong. But I must resist, respectfully and firmly, the remedy they propose. The history of established religion in governance is not a happy one. I have seen what religious orthodoxy does when it acquires political power. The Inquisition, the religious wars of Europe, the persecution of Quakers and Baptists in Virginia. The remedy for a loss of moral consensus is not to reinstate the Church's authority over public life. That is a cure more dangerous than the disease. I wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom from a deep conviction that truth is great and will prevail if left to herself, that she is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error, and has nothing to fear from the conflict, unless, by human interposition, disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate. The remedy to moral confusion is education, genuine education in philosophy, history, the natural sciences, the principles of self-governance, not indoctrination, not the imposition of any single tradition, but the cultivation of the individual rational mind sufficient to discern truth from error. I will say plainly what I believe your two civic religions share as a common error. Neither trusts the individual rational mind. The first demands group loyalty over individual judgment. You must believe what your identity category requires you to believe. The second demands market loyalty over individual judgment. You must believe that private interest, freely pursued, will produce the public good. Both are escapes from the hard work of individual moral reasoning. The remedy is to recommit to that work. In schools, in homes, in the press, in every institution of civic life.
Gentlemen, I have been listening and taking notes, as is my habit. Let me offer a structural observation that I believe has been somewhat neglected in what has otherwise been a rich conversation. What you are describing, two civic religions in irresolvable conflict, is precisely the problem I analyzed in Federalist 10. I wrote that the most common and durable source of faction is the unequal distribution of property. But I also noted that a zeal for different opinions concerning religion and government has inflamed humanity with mutual animosity and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. I did not solve this problem in the Federalist. I proposed to manage it through the extended republic, through separation of powers, through the multiplication of factions so numerous that no single faction could dominate. That system is now under strain, for a reason I can identify precisely. The multiplication of media and communication has allowed factions, rather than being diluted by the extended republic, to find each other across geographic distances and to intensify their commitments without the moderating effect of local, face-to-face community. Your two civic religions are each more coherent and more radical than they would be if people still primarily formed their views through the friction of local civic life. I do not say the church is irrelevant. I do not say education is irrelevant. I say that the constitutional structure must also be reconsidered. Institutions that concentrate factional power, that allow either civic religion to capture a branch of government and use it as a weapon, must be reformed. The remedy is not only spiritual and educational, it is structural. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, but the ambitions must be properly distributed, and at present they are not.
You have each offered a partial remedy, and I believe each of you is right about what you have said. But I want to name the common thread, because I think it has been spoken around without being spoken directly. What you have lost is the willingness to ask anything of each other. Both of your civic religions are, at their root, systems of entitlement. One entitles you to recognition of your identity and redress of your historical grievances. The other entitles you to be left alone with your rights and your property. Neither asks you to sacrifice. Neither asks you to subordinate your interest, your identity, your preference to something larger than yourself. I stepped down from the presidency. I resigned my military commission and returned to private life when I could have held power. I did this not because I was naturally inclined to retirement. I was not. I did it because I believed the Republic required the demonstration that power could be voluntarily surrendered, that some things matter more than what you can take and hold. A republic cannot survive without citizens who are capable of that kind of sacrifice, who can say, "My comfort matters less than the common good. My grievance, however real, must be weighed against the unity of the nation. My liberty, however precious, comes with obligations I did not choose but cannot escape." No church produces this automatically. No school curriculum produces this automatically. No constitutional structure produces this automatically. It requires, in the end, examples, men and women who actually live it, who model what it looks like to put the public good first, and who thereby make it imaginable for others. That is what I fear you have lost most. Not the doctrine, not the institution, not the law, but the examples. Show me the men and women in your public life who have voluntarily surrendered power, wealth, or advantage for the common good, not as a performance, but as a genuine act. Until such examples multiply, I confess I am uncertain that any of our proposed remedies will take root in soil so depleted.
General Washington, you asked for an example of a man who voluntarily surrendered power, everything, for the common good. You asked for an example that might inspire a civilization. I will give you one. He was not a general. He held no office. He commanded no army and signed no constitution. He was a carpenter's son from an occupied province of the empire that would eventually imprison and execute me for preaching his name. He had, at the height of his influence, a following of fishermen, tax collectors, women of ill repute, and the desperate poor. And on the night he was betrayed, on the night the machinery of both religious and political power moved to destroy him, he did not resist. He had the capacity to resist. He chose not to. He submitted to arrest, to mockery, to torture, to public execution in the most humiliating form the Roman world had devised. And he did it, as I wrote to the Philippians, not counting equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptying himself, taking the form of a servant. This is your example of sacrifice, General Washington. Not a man who surrendered the presidency, a man who surrendered everything, including life itself. Not for a nation, not for a political arrangement, not for an idea, but for every human being who has ever lived or will live. A sacrifice so total, so unreserved, so freely given, that it redefined what the word means. And now I will tell you why your nation cannot receive it, and why Mr. Jefferson's remedy of educated, rational minds will not solve the problem. The cross is not reasonable. No rational calculus produces it. No educated mind, reasoning from self-interest, even enlightened self-interest, arrives at, I will give my life for my enemies. The cross is the permanent, unrepeatable, historical demonstration that the deepest human need is not better information or freer institutions. It is liberation from the bondage of the self, the bondage I described in my letter to the Romans. I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. The will that knows the good and cannot choose it. The mind that can argue brilliantly for virtue and live in vice. Your first civic religion cannot receive the cross, because the cross refuses to sort humanity into oppressor and oppressed. Christ died for the Roman soldier who drove the nails. He died for the Pharisee who demanded the execution. He died for the crowd that chose Barabbas. He died for everyone, which means he died for the people your first civic religion has decided do not deserve empathy. An empathy that extends only to the approved categories is not the empathy of the cross. It is a political tool wearing empathy's clothing. Your second civic religion cannot receive the cross, because the cross is the ultimate refutation of individual sovereignty. You cannot look at a man hanging between two criminals, having surrendered every right and every power, and conclude that your personal liberty is the highest good. The cross says the highest human act is not the assertion of the self, but the gift of the self. Not leave me alone with my rights, but take everything I have, including my life, because you need it more than I do. And Thomas, you say the rational mind, educated and freed, will arrive at moral truth. I was educated. I sat at the feet of the greatest rabbi of my generation. I knew the Torah from childhood. I was, by every measure your tradition values, a brilliantly educated, rational mind. And I used that education to hunt down men and women whose only crime was following a carpenter from Nazareth. I held the coats of the men who stoned Stephen to death, and I felt righteous doing it. I had arguments, I had reasons. I had the entire weight of tradition and institutional authority behind me. It took an encounter on a road outside Damascus, an encounter no education produced and no reason predicted, to break what education had built. I do not say this to dismiss learning. I say it because the thing that saves a man is not the perfection of his reasoning. It is the encounter with a love so total, so unearned, so indiscriminate, that it dismantles the self-justifications that even the best education leaves intact.
Paul has spoken the center of it, and I can only add what I know from experience. I spent years as one of the most educated men in the late Roman world. I was a professor of rhetoric. I could argue any position with equal facility. I understood every philosophical system then available. And I was, in those years, precisely what you describe as the product of good education, articulate
analytical, capable of moral reasoning, and utterly incapable of moral transformation. It was not an argument that converted me. It was not a better education. It was a voice, a child's voice, in a garden in Milan, saying, "Take up and read." It was the encounter with a text that was no longer merely information but address. God speaking directly to my condition, naming my bondage, offering liberation I could not produce for myself. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. I did not reason my way to that rest. I fell into it, exhausted by the failure of every other remedy. And so, Mr. Jefferson, when you propose education as the cure, I want to ask you, education toward what end? Toward what vision of human flourishing? Your Enlightenment project assumed that once you removed the distortions of superstition and political tyranny, human reason would naturally converge on truth and virtue. But it did not say why human beings have value. It borrowed that conviction from the tradition it was dismantling, from the belief that human beings are made in the image of God and therefore possess inalienable dignity, and it could not replace it once it had dismantled the source. Your rights are self-evident, but to whom? They were evident to you because you had been formed by 17 centuries of a tradition that insisted every human life bears the image of God. Strip away that tradition, educate several generations entirely apart from it, and watch what becomes self-evident. What becomes self-evident is what we have always seen when the tradition fails, that the strong dominate the weak, that the powerful define the valuable, and that those outside the approved circle of sympathy exist to be used or discarded. The cross stands as the permanent counter-testimony to this. God himself in Christ chose the position of the weak, the condemned, the executed. He identified himself not with the emperor, but with the prisoner, not with the Sanhedrin, but with the accused. He made it permanently impossible for anyone who has truly received this to look at a suffering human being outside their political tribe and feel nothing. Because he was that suffering human being. He is always that suffering human being. This is what your civilization is losing, Mr. Jefferson. Not the arguments, not even the institutions, the image, the living, breathing, culturally transmitted image of what a human being is worth and what love actually costs.
Washington, you asked for examples of voluntary sacrifice. Let me be more specific than the apostle was, because I think the specificity matters for your question about public life. Consider what the soldiers of the past 2 decades gave. They were volunteers, every one. They left families, careers, and the ordinary pleasures of a peaceful life. Many of them left their health permanently. Many left their lives. They did this not for wealth, the pay is modest, and not for fame, most of them are unknown. They did it, by and large, because they believed that some things are worth dying for, that their country, their families, their neighbors were worth the cost. That is the example you called for. The sacrifice has not disappeared. What has disappeared is the moral framework that can receive it, name it, and transmit it as an example worth following. Your first civic religion frequently cannot honor the soldier without first adjudicating whether the war was just. And since the war was prosecuted by the state, and the state is suspect, and the soldier was an instrument of the state, the sacrifice is complicated at best, condemned at worst. Your second civic religion wraps the soldier in the flag, but has lost the theological vocabulary to explain why dying for others is noble. Because in a framework organized entirely around individual rights and liberty, dying for others is ultimately irrational. Only the cross gives you the full account. The soldier who dies for his neighbor is, knowingly or not, participating in the logic of the cross, the logic that says some things matter more than my survival. That logic did not originate in the Enlightenment. It did not originate in the Constitution. It originated in the Gospel and in the tradition, stretching back through the long history of Christian civilization, that formed men and women capable of that kind of love. When you lose the cross, when it becomes merely a cultural artifact, a decoration, a vague symbol of heritage, you lose the only story powerful enough to make self-sacrifice intelligible. You are left with a nation that produces heroes it cannot explain and receives their sacrifice with a gratitude it cannot sustain.
I want to speak carefully here, because I come from a tradition that does not share Paul's convictions about the carpenter from Nazareth, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I want to say what I can affirm without reservation. The tradition Paul and I both inherited knew that some things are worth dying for. We called it Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name. Our people have died, in every generation, for the refusal to betray what is true. The Maccabees, the martyrs of every persecution. Men and women who could have saved their lives by saying a word they did not believe, and chose death instead. This is not irrationality. It is the supreme expression of the conviction that truth is more real than survival, and that the author of truth is more to be feared than any Caesar. What your civilization has lost, Mr. Jefferson, is not the capacity for this conviction. Human beings are made for it. What you have lost is the formation, the long, patient, communal transmission of a story large enough to make that conviction make sense. You cannot produce Kiddush Hashem, or its equivalent in your tradition, through a curriculum. You produce it through a community that has lived the story so deeply that it becomes the air people breathe. The family table, the weekly Sabbath, the yearly cycle of memory and hope, the prayers said in the same words your grandfather said and his grandfather before him. This is what no government can give and no government can take, but which governments and cultures and educational institutions can destroy, slowly, by teaching generation after generation that the stories are mythology, the obligations are optional, and the only authority is the self.
Jefferson, you said truth needs no protection, only freedom to contend. I will grant you that freedom matters, but consider your own experiment. You built a nation on the proposition that certain truths are self-evident, that human beings are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. You then built institutions explicitly designed to prevent your government from establishing religion or compelling belief. You trusted that free, rational minds, given the space, would sustain the moral convictions necessary for self-governance. 2.5 centuries later, the conviction that human beings have God-given dignity is no longer self-evident to a substantial portion of your educated population, because they have concluded, rationally and consistently, that if there is no creator, there is no endowment, and therefore rights are not discovered but invented, which means they can be uninvented by whoever has sufficient power to do so. This is not an irrational conclusion. It follows directly from the premises your secular education has established. You built your house on what you believed was bedrock. What you built on was borrowed capital, the accumulated moral conviction of a tradition you did not replenish. The capital is nearly spent. The remedy is not a return to compulsion. I am not arguing that the state should force belief. I am saying that a community serious about surviving must be serious about transmission, must treat the passing on of its binding moral framework not as one option among many, but as the most urgent work of every generation. Not education in the general sense, formation, deliberate, demanding, communal formation in a tradition that knows why things are wrong and can say so with an authority that does not bend to the political weather. The cross, as Paul has said, is that authority for his tradition. The Torah is that authority for mine. The question your civilization must answer is, what is yours? And the reasonable conclusions of educated individuals is not an answer. It is the absence of one.
Rabbi Shammai, you have put the question as precisely as it can be put, and I find I cannot answer it with the confidence I would like. That is itself, I think, a kind of answer. Let me tell you what I believe, plainly as I prefer, and then let you and the others judge it. I am not Paul. I have not had a road to Damascus. I have sat in many churches, read many theologies, and found in most of them more heat than light, more dispute about the furniture of heaven than instruction about the conduct of earth. I have never been able to settle the question of whether Jesus was divine to my own satisfaction, and I decided some years ago that I was unlikely to resolve it before my circumstances changed sufficiently to allow me to ask directly, a brief pause for the smile to register. But I want to be careful that my uncertainty about the theology is not mistaken for indifference to the substance. I believe in God, not as a formality, not as a civic decoration. I believe, and the longer I lived, the more convinced I became, that, as I said in the last great assembly I attended, God governs in the affairs of men. I have seen too much improbable good fortune in the affairs of this republic, and in my own life, to believe that human cleverness produced it unaided. I was not always a modest man, but on this point I have been genuinely humbled, and I believe in what I once called practical virtue, the moral habits that every serious religious tradition, for all their quarrels about doctrine, converges upon in practice. Do not lie, do not steal, keep your promises, care for those who cannot care for themselves. Do not do to your neighbor what you would not have done to yourself. Which I notice Rabbi Hillel has already said better than I can. These are not the conclusions of unaided reason. They are the accumulated deposit of centuries of human experience with what happens when people don't follow them. Every civilization that has ignored them has paid for it. Every civilization that has practiced them, imperfectly, with backsliding and hypocrisy, but genuinely, has produced something worth inheriting. Now, Rabbi Shammai asks, what is America's authority? And I confess he has found the crack in the foundation, because America's founders, and I count myself among them with appropriate humility, made a wager. The wager was that you could have the moral fruits of the religious tradition without requiring doctrinal agreement on its roots, that men of different faiths, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, Deist, and the honestly uncertain like myself, could nevertheless agree on enough to sustain a republic, because the practical moral content of their traditions overlapped sufficiently to produce shared civic virtue. That wager has not entirely failed, but I will say this: it required, for its success, something we perhaps did not build in with sufficient care. It required that the various religious traditions remain vigorous and serious, that they continue doing the work of moral formation in their own communities, so that the shared civic space could benefit from citizens who had been formed somewhere, even if that somewhere was not identical. The wager assumed a background of serious faith producing serious character, against which a pluralist public square could function. What your generation has produced, if I understand the description correctly, is a public square that has not merely tolerated the diversity of religious traditions, but has actively taught, through its most prestigious institutions, that all such traditions are equally arbitrary, equally the products of power and culture, equally unsuitable as the basis for public moral claims. And then it has been surprised to discover that the public square has no moral content. This is not, I think, what Thomas Jefferson intended. He wanted to protect sincere faith from coerced faith. He wanted the Baptist minister to preach without a license, and the Quaker to live by his conscience. He did not intend, and I think he would acknowledge this if pressed, to produce a civilization that teaches its children that conscience itself is merely preference dressed in philosophical clothing. So to answer your question, Rabbi, America's authority, the thing that stands behind its moral claims, cannot be the Torah, because not every American is a Jew. It cannot be the cross, because not every American is a Christian. It cannot be my deism, because that has even fewer takers than either. But it can be, it must be, if the Republic is to survive. The shared acknowledgement that we are accountable to something beyond ourselves, that there is a moral order we did not invent and cannot revise by majority vote, that the rights we claim are grounded in something more durable than our own preferences. I cannot tell you precisely what to call that something. I have never been able to. But I know what its absence produces. And I know that the various religious traditions in this room, for all their fierce disagreements, are each of them in the business of pointing toward it, a republic that treats them as merely quaint, as artifacts of a pre-rational age, has not freed itself from superstition. It has merely substituted newer and, I would argue, less tested superstitions of its own. I am an old man. I was always an old man in this company. And I will say what old men are permitted to say. I got some things wrong. I trusted that the moral common ground was more self-sustaining than it proved to be. I did not reckon sufficiently with how much work the churches, the synagogues, the families, and the local communities were doing beneath the surface of the Enlightenment Republic I helped to build. Now that work has faltered, the surface remains, the language of rights, the constitutional structure, the civic ceremonies. But the foundation beneath it is less certain than I assumed. The answer to your question, Rabbi, is this. America needs a renewal of the conviction, held seriously, lived practically, transmitted deliberately, that there is a God, that he governs in the affairs of men, that human beings are accountable to him, and that this accountability is what gives our rights their force and our duties their weight. Whether that renewal comes through the cross or the Torah, or some less theologically precise form of what I once called public religion, I leave to wiser men than myself. What I am certain of is that the reasonable conclusions of educated individuals is, as you say, the absence of an answer. I should have seen that sooner. I had enough evidence.
Dr. Franklin, you have said what I confess I could not say as well. That the wager failed, not because the premise was wrong, but because the conditions that made it workable were quietly dismantled. I take that point seriously, and I will not pretend otherwise. A pluralist public square that benefits from the moral formation happening in its religious communities requires that those communities remain vigorous. We assumed a background we did not replenish. On this, you have found me. But I must now ask this assembly to hear what I am actually arguing, because I think Rabbi Shammai's formulation, however precise, has obscured it. He has posed the question as though my position and his are the only two options available. Either receive divine law or the reasonable conclusions of educated individuals. I reject that framing entirely. It is not the choice before us. You say the answer is law, divine law, received and not invented. I want to take that proposition with the seriousness it deserves, which means I must ask the question you have not answered. Received by whom? Interpreted by whom? Enforced by whom? I will not reach for distant historical examples when the best one is sitting at this very table. Paul, before Damascus, had received divine law. He had received it from the finest teacher of his generation, in the tradition he describes as the most rigorous and faithful in Israel. He was, by every measure his tradition provided, correctly formed. His conscience was clear. His reasoning was sound. His institutional authority was legitimate. And he used that received divine law to hunt men and women through the streets of Jerusalem and hold the coats of those who murdered Stephen. I do not say this to wound him. He has said it himself, with more candor than I could ask. I say it because it is the most important data point in this entire conversation, and Rabbi Shammai's formulation has no answer to it. Received divine law did not protect Stephen, it killed him. And the man who administered it was not ignorant, not malicious, not poorly formed. He was the product of exactly the system Rabbi Shammai is recommending: rigorous, disciplined, certain of his authority, accountable to a law he did not invent. This is not an aberration. It is the pattern. The inquisitors received divine law. The men who drove the Baptists from Virginia received divine law. The armies that turned Europe into a graveyard for a century, on both sides of every theological line, received divine law, each from a tradition of genuine depth, genuine learning, and genuine sincerity. Sincerity did not protect their victims. Received law did not protect their victims. What eventually protected their victims, imperfectly, gradually, at enormous cost, was the principle I have spent my life defending: that the civil magistrate has no authority over conscience, and that no institution, however ancient, however learned, however sincerely convinced of its divine commission, may use the power of law to compel belief. I want to be precisely understood. I am not arguing against religion. I am not arguing against the Torah. I am not arguing against the cross. I am not arguing against divine law as a voluntary commitment freely held within a community of believers who have chosen it. The Baptist minister preaching to his congregation, let him preach. The rabbi teaching his students, let him teach. The bishop forming his flock in the love of Augustine's God, let him form them, and God grant him success. What I am arguing against, what I will always argue against, is the moment that received divine law reaches for the coercive power of the state. Not because I doubt your sincerity, because I have read the history of your sincerity. And the history of sincere, received, institutionally authorized divine law wielding political power is a history I will not romanticize simply because the current alternatives are unsatisfying. Benjamin, you said America needs the shared acknowledgement that we are accountable to something beyond ourselves. I will not dispute this. But accountable to something beyond ourselves is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. The moment you try to specify what that something is with sufficient precision to ground a public law, you have entered the territory where Paul before Damascus lived, and where every inquisitor in history has lived with perfect confidence. My remedy is not the absence of religion. It is the protection of religion, including from itself. A faith freely chosen, freely practiced, freely transmitted, freely argued for in the public square. This is what I built the wall to protect. Not to imprison, to protect. The wall runs both ways. I know what it costs to build without sufficient foundation. I have lived that contradiction more completely than any man in this room. But I would rather rebuild the foundation by persuasion, by example, by the slow restoration of communities serious enough about their traditions to transmit them, than by reaching for the law to do what love has failed to do. Law that compels worship produces hypocrites, not believers. And hypocrites, as I think every man at this table will agree, are the worst possible foundation for any republic or any church.
Forgive the interruption, Mr. Jefferson. And I will say at once that the Apostle Paul has earned the first and fullest reply to what you have argued, and I will not presume to take that from him. What I have to say is structural rather than theological, and perhaps it will clear some ground before he speaks. I want to say something that will surprise this table. On the essential point, Jefferson, you are correct. Coercive religious authority wielding the power of the state is among the most dangerous arrangements human civilization has produced. I have no romantic attachment to theocracy. I have seen what institutional certainty does when it acquires political force, and I share your alarm at it. But, and I must be direct, your remedy does not work. And we have the evidence before us. You built the wall. It is in the First Amendment, which I helped to frame and which I regard as essential. And I ask you to look honestly at what it has produced over 2.5 centuries. Not the flourishing of free religious communities forming virtuous citizens in a pluralist public square, but precisely the two civic religions we have been describing all evening. Both of them exercise coercive social power. Both of them have captured institutions, universities, media, courts, corporations, organs of government, and use them to enforce orthodoxy with a zeal that would have impressed any inquisitor. They cannot imprison you for heresy. They can destroy your livelihood, your reputation, your family's peace, and your ability to participate in public life. The wall separates church from state. It has not separated ideological faction from institutional power. And ideological faction, as I have argued since the beginning of this republic, is the form that tyranny takes in democratic societies. Our wall is a fence around a specific threat. It does not address the general problem, which is not religious coercion specifically, but factional capture of institutional power generally. The remedy to that problem is not a constitutional principle. It is a constitutional architecture, the very architecture I spent my life building, capable of checking every faction, religious or secular, that attempts to seize the whole. Here is what I mean concretely. What prevents any single faction, including a religious one, from dominating a republic? Not a parchment barrier. Parchment barriers have never stopped a determined faction and never will. What prevents domination is the multiplication and organization of competing powers. Federal against state, executive against legislative, judicial against both, commercial interest against agrarian interest, urban against rural, each checking the other not because they are virtuous, but because they are ambitious. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. This is Madison's formulation, and I accept it as the operating principle of free government. The failure you are diagnosing, the moral vacancy, the factional civic religions filling the space where shared conviction used to be, is not primarily a failure of the First Amendment. It is a failure of the institutional architecture to remain vigorous. When I built the financial system, I was not merely solving an accounting problem. I was binding the interests of citizens to the survival of the Republic, giving them a stake through funded debt and national commerce in the nation's coherence. A man who owns a piece of the national enterprise does not lightly destroy it. Interest is not virtue, but properly organized, it substitutes for virtue in ways that pure constitutional principle cannot. What has happened in the generations since is that the institutional architecture has been captured, not by a church, but by two warring factions who have each seized portions of it and turned those portions against the other. The remedy is reconstruction, not of the wall, which should stand, but of the whole architecture, the checks, the balances, the distributed powers, the organized competing interests that gives the Republic the structural capacity to hold any faction in check, including the religious ones Jefferson fears and the secular ones the rest of us should fear equally. And now, Paul deserves the floor. Jefferson has used your own life as his argument, and you have earned the right to answer it in full.
Thomas, I want to begin where you ended, not with the argument, but with the man. You looked at my life before Damascus, and you saw correctly. I was exactly what you described. Educated, sincere, institutionally authorized, certain of my divine commission, and murderous. You did not exaggerate. You did not distort. The record I have given you myself, in my own letters, is worse than what you said. I did not merely hold courts. I ravaged the church. I went house to house. I dragged men and women out. I committed them to prison. I was the instrument of a received divine law, wielded with institutional force, against people whose only crime was believing something I had decided was heresy. You are right about all of it. Now, I want to ask you to stay with me in that moment, on the road to Damascus before the light, because I think it is the most important moment in this entire conversation. And I do not think you have fully looked at it. I was not stopped by a better argument. You must understand this. There was no argument available in the first century that could have reached me. I had heard the arguments. I had read the testimony of Stephen's face as he died, like the face of an angel, the record says, and I had not been moved. I had heard men and women in the prisons I filled speak of their Lord with a conviction that should have given me pause. And I had not paused. The arguments existed, the evidence existed, the example of transformed lives existed all around me. And I, educated, sincere, rigorous, formed, was unmoved. What stopped me was not an argument, it was a voice. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And the question that followed, who are you, Lord? And the answer that shattered every category I possessed. Now, Thomas, listen carefully, because this is where I must push back against you with everything I have. You have built your entire system on the premise that the primary danger to human conscience is external. The inquisitor, the magistrate, the established church, the coercive institution. And you have designed your remedy accordingly. A wall that keeps those external forces from reaching the individual conscience. I am telling you that the wall does not address the primary danger, because the primary danger is not external. It was not the Sanhedrin that made me what I was before Damascus. It was my own will, my own pride, my own absolute certainty that I was righteous. Certainty so complete that I could watch a man die with the peace of a person doing God's work. The Sanhedrin gave me authority. My own nature gave me the capacity to use it without mercy. Your wall, Thomas, your magnificent, carefully constructed, constitutionally enshrined wall, protects the Stephens of the world from the souls. This is a genuine good, and I will not diminish it, but it cannot produce the Paul. It cannot reach the place where the soul lives, in the will, in the pride, in the absolute self-certainty of a man who has decided he is righteous. Only an encounter with a love more absolute than his certainty can reach that place. And that encounter cannot be legislated, cannot be constitutionally protected into existence, cannot be produced by any architecture, however brilliant. Colonel Hamilton, your architecture is impressive. I mean that without condescension. The organization of competing interests, the checking of factions by factions, the distribution of power so that no single ambition can dominate. All of this is real wisdom. And the Republic without it will not survive. But I want to ask you something that your architecture cannot answer. What happens when every faction has been formed by the same fundamental disorder? When the ambitions you are setting against one another all flow from the same disordered love, the love of self, the love of power, the love of dominance dressed in the language of justice? You can set them against each other. You cannot, through architecture alone, change what they love. Thomas, you said you want only to protect religion from itself. You want faith freely chosen rather than coerced. I honor that. Genuinely. And I will tell you something that may surprise you. In the world where I lived and preached and was imprisoned, there was no First Amendment. There was no wall. There was only Rome and its absolute indifference to what its subjects believed, so long as they paid their taxes and sacrificed to the emperor's genius on the appropriate occasions. And in that world, Without your wall, without your constitutional protections, without any of the institutional safeguards you have spent your life building, the gospel spread from a handful of frightened fishermen in an occupied province to every corner of the Mediterranean world within a generation. I do not say this to dismiss your wall. I say it because I want you to see that the thing you are most trying to protect, genuine, freely chosen, transforming faith, has never depended primarily on constitutional protection for its survival. It has survived prisons and executions, and the systematic power of the most efficient state the ancient world produced. What it cannot survive, what I fear it is not surviving in your civilization, is not persecution, it is comfort. It is the soft, well-lit, constitutionally protected indifference of a people who have been given every freedom and cannot find a reason to use them for anything larger than themselves. Your wall keeps the inquisitor out. It cannot keep the emptiness out. And it is the emptiness, Thomas, not the inquisitor, that is filling with your two civic religions. You asked what authority America can claim. I have told you mine. The cross is not a constitutional principle. It is not an institutional arrangement. It is a man dying for his enemies and refusing to stop loving them while he did it. That is the example General Washington asked for. That is the sacrifice that makes all other sacrifice intelligible. And it asks nothing of your government except that it leave the road to Damascus open. That is all. Keep the road open. I will take my chances with the rest. I do not say this to dismiss your wall. I say it because I want you to see that the thing you are most trying to protect, genuine, freely chosen, transforming faith, has never depended primarily on constitutional protection for its survival. It has survived prisons and executions, and the systematic power of the most efficient state the ancient world produced. What it cannot survive, what I fear it is not surviving in your civilization, is not persecution. It is comfort. It is the soft, well-lit, constitutionally protected indifference of a people who have been given every freedom and cannot find a reason to use them for anything larger than themselves. Your wall keeps the inquisitor out. It cannot keep the emptiness out. And it is the emptiness, Thomas, not the inquisitor, and that is filling with your two civic religions. You asked what authority America can claim. I have told you mine. The cross is not a constitutional principle. It is not an institutional arrangement. It is a man dying for his enemies and refusing to stop loving them while he did it. That is the example General Washington asked for. That is the sacrifice that makes all other sacrifice intelligible. And it asks nothing of your government except that it leave the road to Damascus open. That is all. Keep the road open. I will take my chances with the rest.
Colonel Hamilton, I want to engage your argument with the seriousness it deserves, because it is the most serious argument available to a man of your convictions, and I have spent a great portion of my intellectual life answering it. Not in your republic. In Rome, you have described, with impressive precision, an architecture of competing institutional powers, organized so that no single faction can dominate. Ambition, counteracting ambition. Interest, checking interest. The distribution of power across so many centers that capture becomes structurally improbable. This is genuine wisdom. I do not dismiss it. Rome had it. Rome had the most sophisticated institutional architecture the ancient world produced. Senate checking consul, tribune checking senate, army answering to law, law administered by jurists of extraordinary learning and genuine integrity, a system of distributed powers, competing magistracies, and organized interests that had held, with modifications and crises, for centuries. When I was a young man studying rhetoric in Carthage, the Roman system was the envy and the template of every serious political thinker. Its durability was its argument, its longevity was its proof. I watched it collapse, not quickly, not simply, not from a single cause, but I watched it, and I wrote 447 pages in the City of God, explaining precisely what I observed, because the pagans around me were insisting that Christianity had weakened it, and I needed to show them they were wrong about the cause. The Goths did not destroy Rome. The Goths walked through what was already rubble, dressed in marble. Rome destroyed Rome, and the mechanism of its self-destruction is exactly what I want to put before you now, because I believe your republic is running the same mechanism at a different speed. The question I spent years answering is this: why did the institutional architecture fail? It did not fail because the architecture was poorly designed. It failed because the people within it had changed what they loved. And when what a people loves changes, no institutional arrangement survives unchanged, because institutions are not self-executing. They require people to operate them, people who must choose, in 1,000 daily acts, to honor the spirit of the structure rather than exploit its procedures for private gain. The Roman Senate, in its great centuries, was composed of men who, whatever their personal faults, understood themselves to be bound by something larger than their individual interest. Call it gravitas, pietas, virtus, the Roman vocabulary for the loves that make self-sacrifice for the Republic not merely possible but natural. When Cincinnatus left his plough to save Rome and then returned to his plough when the crisis was over, this was not institutional design producing virtuous behavior. This was a man formed by loves ordered towards something beyond himself, operating within an institution designed to channel such loves toward the public good. By the time I was born, the Senate had become, in substantial measure, a theater. The forms were maintained. The procedures were honored. The vocabulary of a republic remained. But the love beneath it, the genuine willingness to sacrifice private interest for public good, had been replaced, gradually, invisibly, by the love of self dressed in republican clothing. And the institutional architecture, however clever, had no mechanism for detecting or correcting this substitution. It could check one ambitious man against another. It could not change what the ambitious men were ambitious for. This is my question for your architecture, Colonel. You say ambition must be made to counteract ambition. I accept this as a necessary principle. But I ask you, what happens when the ambitions on every side of your carefully constructed check have been formed by the same fundamental disorder, when the faction on the left and the faction on the right and the faction in the center are all, beneath their different vocabularies, organized around the love of dominance, the libido dominandi, the lust to rule, which I described as the defining disease of the city of man? You can set them against each other indefinitely. What you will produce is not a republic. It is a more efficiently organized competition among disordered loves, which will consume the institutional architecture from within while preserving its forms. And I am not theorizing. I watched this happen. The forms of Roman governance persisted long after the substance had been hollowed out. The titles remained. The ceremonies continued. The legal vocabulary was maintained with impressive precision. And the civilization dissolved, not because the architecture was poorly designed, but because the loves that had once animated it had been replaced by loves that the architecture was not built to correct. I want to say something that is not argument but testimony. I lived in a dying civilization. I was born into it, educated by it, honored by it. I held the most prestigious academic chair in the Western Empire before my conversion. I loved Rome's learning. I loved its rhetoric. I was shaped by it in ways I still cannot fully account for, and I watched it end. What I observed in those final decades was not a dramatic collapse. It was a quiet exhaustion, a civilization that had lost the answer to the question, what is all of this for? The games continued, the administration functioned, the laws were administered, but the energy that had once animated genuine sacrifice for the common good, the love of something larger than the self, had been spent, and without it, the architecture was a skeleton, impressive in structure, no longer alive. Your republic is not Rome. I do not say it is. Your constitutional architecture is in some respects more sophisticated than Rome's, and Paul has demonstrated tonight that at least some of its citizens are capable of the kind of argument that suggests genuine moral seriousness. But I'm asking you to look honestly at the two civic religions we have been describing, the loves that are actually organizing your civilization's energy right now, and tell me whether your architecture can correct them, not contain them temporarily, correct them, change what they love. Because if it cannot, if the architecture can only organize the competition without transforming the competitors, then what you have built is, at best, a longer timeline before the same destination. And I speak as a man who has seen the destination and can tell you it arrives more quietly than you expect, and that the forms persist long after the substance is gone, which makes it very difficult to see coming until it has already arrived. The question Paul asked Jefferson is the same question I am asking you. Your wall keeps the road open. Your architecture organizes the traffic. But who is forming the travelers? What are they being formed to love? And by what institution? What community? What tradition capable of reaching the will rather than merely the intellect or the interest? Is that formation happening? If you have an answer to that question that does not eventually require something like what Paul described on the road to Damascus, an encounter with a love more absolute than the self's love of itself, I have read too much history to believe it, but I am listening.